Thanks for being here on the channel, folks. It is Tuesday, December 6th. I am here with Douglas Gabriel and Michael McKibben. We're going to talk again. This is going to be part 3 of what has become the Cartel Babylon expose and the work that they've been uncovering both through Americans for Innovation and through Gabriel's Horn and Aim for Truth. Deep dives into the origins of usury, how it has become the enslavement prison planet that we now live in, and discussing the history of that and getting into current events to do with it. And today we're going to first give you a little bit of a summary again, talking about the Radonites coming out of Babylon, basically moving across the world kind of as a cartel to become the leaders of all of the biggest banking and institutions, royal families, countries in the world. And so whichever one of you wants to take it away, go right ahead.
Yeah, one of the things we've recognized in digging up this information about the Radonite Jews is that this information has been some of the most buried histories that I've ever read. And because it spans 4,000 years, there's a lot of material out there when you know where to look. And so that's what's happening right now. But I will just remind you what triggered this is we discovered the writings of a 9th century Arab historian, geographer, who was also the postmaster general of Babylon, and he was the chief intelligence officer of Babylon. And he wrote in the 9th century, that's the 800s, about these Radonite Jews that were essentially running the state of Babylon for Nebuchadnezzar and Darius and others. And there was no question that these Jews existed. And the question remained, well, who were these Jews? Because it's now become quite obvious that a group calling themselves Jews have been running the state of Babylon for many millennia. We're not talking about the time span of the United States. We're talking about something that's 7 or 8 times that long. And what he described in the 8th century, and this was two centuries before the First Crusade, these traders that ran the Silk Road from China all the way to France and into what later became the UK. And that was intriguing because we've never heard of these Jews. And what we had heard of were groups like Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews. We started looking at, okay, when did that develop? And when we recognized that it was about the time of the First Crusade, our spidey sense started going up that, oh, we're looking at some sort of agenda here, historical agenda. Now that may seem strange, but I think the great leap we made in our assumptions that led our investigation was that maybe we're not dealing with a human being. Maybe we're dealing with some sort of demon, some super demon. And what we have now discovered is that we are dealing with the demons that ran Babylon ever since they gave blessing, the king gave blessing to the practice of usury, charging interest on loans. And what we have as a very definitive landmark in the history of the world is the Hammurabi Code, which I think it's Rule 101, gave permission to charge interest. And what we then began to see is that, and back then, by the way, they were charging up to 33% interest on some loans. And so what we began to see here is that interest, the charging of interest in banking and usury was part and parcel of the economies of the world ever since the inception of modern civilization. And that one of the key elements, key resources of banking and usury was slavery. And that included what you would think of as slavery, indentured servitude, but also the idea of debt slavery. Once you've got somebody involved in a debt to another person, then the opportunity exists to make a slave out of the one who can't pay the debt. And after you've done that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, you become really good at it, an expert at it. And if you're controlling the states, the kings of the ancient world, then essentially you're running the ancient world, not those kings. And that's what we've discovered, that these people who call themselves Jews. Now, here's another key element that I'd like Douglas to comment on this, is specifically what we're seeing is that these people who called themselves Jews coming out of Babylon had so intermarried by real marriage and also concubines and the houses of prostitution, the temples of prostitution, all across the Babylonian Empire, that they had so watered down any notion that they were Jewish that in fact what they did is they essentially borrowed, subsumed the notion of Jew and applied it to banking, specifically to banking. And in doing so, they confused the entire world as to what it meant to be a Hebrew, and used the term Jew because what they needed historically, anciently, was an association with one of the great Abrahamic religions. That's what they were looking for. Because as long as they were pagans who worshipped Moloch, Ahriman, Baal, and Mammon, as long as they were pagans, they didn't get the same respect as they traveled around the known world at the time. But as soon as they subsumed the idea of being a Jew, then they borrowed basically the respect that the Hebrew people had in the world and have used that ever since. I'm going to stop there.
Excellent. Great summary. And so we see this basically a kind of stolen identity. And
Right.
one thing that's been coming to me over this time of learning what you all are discovering here is really kind of the hostage taking of an entire group of people that is, of the Hebrew faith, right? But is subsumed and controlled by an elite, ancient Roddenite sourced group of banksters, a cartel that is wanting to enslave and control the world, including the people who identify as Jewish in their faith today. And I think this is really well seen in the exploitation of the Israelis today in what happened with the shots, with the use of the entire state of Israel to make a deal with Pfizer in order to use the experimentation on the Israelis 100% vaccinated as the testing group of guinea pigs. And so this is a very key point, I think, for people to understand, is that there is this bankster elite using the system of anti-Semitism, the victim status that was created through the controlling of all the wars leading us to here, the control of the commentary around the Holocaust, the creation of the Holocaust, etc. Now continuing into this time today, where they are experimenting on the people who identify as the Hebrew faith people in Israel. And so experimenting en masse on these people in an agreement with a transhumanist company that's attempting to change our entire DNA, into the beast system in the state of Israel, literally with the health ministry of Israel signing over these people's lives to Pfizer to be the experimental guinea pigs. So I wanted to bring that in there so people to understand the depth here, that we're talking about thieves, we're talking about mass manipulators, and people who just identify so intensely with Mammon, they will steamroll anybody and everything, and especially use their own to get ahead in whatever way they decide they want to. So I'll pass that on to you, Douglas.
Well, you're quite right, Free, and I like the way that you put that. In fact, the Hebrew people, I have nothing against the Hebrew people, even though some people say that there are no Hebrews, there never were any Hebrews. And if you look at the haplogroups, the only thing you can identify are people who are from the Levant, period. They could be Amorites, they could be Canaanites, they could be Chaldean, Assyrian, Babylonian, whatever. But when it comes down to what was told about the ancient Hebrews, and by the way, the word Jew you will find only used from about the 5th century AD on, according to the propaganda. Complete nonsense. The Babylonians were calling them Jews in 600 BC and even before. And so what you really have here is the Hebrew people have basically been annihilated, and banksters using fractional banking, which is pure and absolute evil because it's a different law for the bankers than it is for the rest of us. The bankers can go bankrupt. The bankers can have bad deals go down. And what happens to them? Absolutely nothing. Still to this very day, banks are immune practically from prosecution. And the people who took over this bankster industry, which was then passed down from family member to family member, well, that was the diaspora, which I call an invasion. It was a Rhodanite invasion of the rest of the world. And at this point, they are in control of the majority of the Western civilization. And the Hebrew people have been given a very bad rap. So I always would say, long before we started this research, don't call anybody a Jew. There's no such thing. And if you want to call someone a Hebrew, make sure you understand that their religion has to be dead. The Hebrew religion has to be dead. Why? Because there are no full-blooded Hebrews left on the face of the earth, let alone a man and a woman who could then create the culmination of the Hebrew faith, which was to bring the Messiah. So at this point, there are the Samaritans and there are Ethiopians who are less than 10% Hebrew, and they're the ones left holding the bag. But the people who were called Jews were invaders that invaded every single trade route, from the Silk Road to the Roman trade routes throughout the entire Roman kingdom. And remember, when they were held in captivity, supposedly, in Egypt, they also ruled Egypt. And so when it comes down to it, you cannot find a reference to Jews, as it were, that isn't directly connected with infiltrating through subterfuge other nations, marrying into them, and then blaming it on those nations. So they blame the Babylonians for the 2 exiles. Complete nonsense. We have discovered that those were essentially an invitation and an invasion of Babylon by the Hebrew people. But then they were basically not bred out of existence, which is what we're told in the propaganda. They were bred out of existence. They gave up their daughters, and mind you, Hebrew in those days could have as many wives as they want. They didn't even have to have a ceremony, and they could marry and divorce by the will of the man. All he had to do was say, I wed you, I wed you, I wed you, or I divorce you, divorce you, divorce you, and that's it. That's it, completely. So they used their children, and they had lots of children, for intermarriage. And the intermarrying happened first in Babylon with the Sogdians. And so the ancient Hebrews turned into the bankers who were the Radhanites. And the Radhanites took over the Sogdian routes. They took over the Roman routes of trade. Later, they took over even the Hanseatic League. They were the bankers behind the Hanseatic League, which started the trade by water, by boats. And the Hanseatic League was the precursor to, of course, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, which it was a war between those 2 companies. These are private-owned businesses that really created the American Revolution. And it is very little understood that to this very day, when people hide behind the fake title of a Jew, they can't possibly be a Jew. And if they say they're Ashkenazi, then for sure they're definitely not Jewish, because they have much more Goyim blood in them, pagan blood, European blood in them, than they have any Hebrew blood in them. And if you look at the haplogroup indications, you really cannot prove that anybody is a true Hebrew. You can get down to the specific haplogroup that ruled the Levant. Well, that went to Ethiopia. It went to Turkey. It went to Armenia. It went all over the place. But what it for sure didn't do is the stories that we're told. For instance, the Talmud, they say, was created in the 5th century AD. 100% incorrect. It was created 600 BC. And so the Talmud was nothing more than a complete rewriting of the Hebrew faith. So if somebody arises out of Ashkenazism, out of being Sephardic or any of the other types of Jews, and they're using either the Zohar or they're using the Talmud, that's not Hebrew. That has nothing to do with the religion. Those are man-made rules, made up stories, mythologies, literally fairy tales in the Zohar and in other works that they use to control the narrative. And it is basically propaganda. And even if you take the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, look closely. They're 100% plagiarisms from the Chaldeans, the Chaldean book of Number, the Chaldean book of Genesis, directly taken. So Moses didn't write those books. And remember, Moses was a Chaldean. He married Deborah, the daughter of Jethro, who was a Chaldean. And so when it comes down to it, you can't really name a time that the Hebrews, including Abraham, who was really a Babylonian Chaldean, who'd claimed all the land from Babylon to the Mediterranean as his. Well, what gave him the right to do so? Once again, it was an invasion. They also invented the pogrom, they invented Holocaust, and they invented what we now know as debt slavery through the Hammurabi Code. So the Hebrews did not follow the 10 commandments that were in Babylon. They followed the Hammurabi Code. They were not Jews. They were not even Hebrews. And so what we're finding now is every single time you hear a statement about ancient Jews or modern Jews, you can guarantee that it is a lie.
Wow, biggest lies, right? They get deeper and more complex as they go throughout history in order to really confuse everybody and control everyone. And so as we look at, I was wondering if either of you could bring this to the time of Jesus, bring it to the time of I guess you would say he was expelling the Radhanites from the temple, right? And the demon of Mammon. But bring it to that time period. Who is he dealing with, at that time?
Well, I mean, think about it. The cleansing of the temple occurred on the first day that he was in Jerusalem after the Palm Sunday entry. And what is the first thing he did? He went and cleansed the temple. And that was an exorcism. And it's interesting that that was his first act, because he then subsequently allowed himself to be sacrificed and his blood spilled for the sins of the whole world. Well, he wanted the temple cleansed because he had told people that the temple would be destroyed and built in 3 days. And of course, they thought he was being ridiculous, because who could build a temple that fast? But he was talking about himself. And isn't it interesting that he specifically named the fact that you can't serve God and Mammon? Either you'll love one and hate the other, or you'll hate the other and love the other. So the idea that he was talking specifically about Babylon and Mammon and the users banking system that Israel was obviously under, along with the rest of the world, you see something quite significant. And then we read in Revelation about, in John the Revelator, in chapters 2 and 3, he twice refers to false Jews. And I am now very confident he was referring to Babylonian Radhanites. And he knew that they were in charge of the banking systems of that entire part of the world. And he was calling them, he said, you can't, these people are lying. They're not Jews. And at that time, they didn't refer to the name Radhanite, because Radhan was a name that was applied to the area where they lived outside of Baghdad much later. But he was referring to the region and the people that existed there. And now, as Douglas said, we see hard evidence that in 600 BC, there were various banking families that called themselves Jewish that were running Babylon. And now we're looking at older records that system had already been operating for a good 800 or 900 years before that. because we're finding contracts where they're talking about interest rates. And so by 600 AD, we see that the prophets of Israel were railing against charging of interest, and yet the Jews of the time ignored it. And then so by the time Christ came, he was addressing a sin that had subsumed the entire world. And I would argue that he gave us hope. He gave us a way out. He gave us a path to salvation. But it looks like most of the Christian world fell back into the same system to the point we are today, where we have forsaken. I mean, think about it. I can't tell you in the last couple of weeks since we started talking about this, how many people have considered it actually impossible that we could operate our economy without usury, even Christians.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And that's, that is the question here, because as we move forward, people don't even have a concept of what an economy can look like, and how we can live in civilization without this built-in mechanism that has been controlling the world for so long, enslaving humanity for so long. And it really, I think it's gone almost, it's so genetically into our DNA through generations, and the grooming and the generations and the mind control, because it becomes a mind control, both psychologically, societally, propagandized, but also almost physically, because really most of the love of mammon is an addictive process of being addicted to what mammon offers us, and what really is mostly sinful things. And I heard a great commentator, Royce White, describe something the other day. He was saying, and that's at roycewhite.substack.com, great guy. He was saying that basically we're being controlled by mammon, controlling humanity through dopamine. And you all have talked about how the Radhanites, as they moved in, out of the Babylonian Empire into the West and the East there, and started their trading. Most of it was in either slavery, sex slavery, drugs, spices, and the addictive things of tea, coffee, etc. I don't know about coffee at that time, but tea for sure. This thing that changes our biochemical makeup and really wants us coming back for more. And of course, money being the ultimate one of that. And so as we look at now, where everything is just a giant, pile of sloth out there, where everybody is just spending all their time instead of focused on God and God's gifts. Instead, it's all about this materialism, this mammon, and to the point where people don't even know how to extract themselves from it. And you really can't know until you really increase your faith and you really focus on God and change your life in that way. It's almost impossible to extract yourself from those distractions.
That's why I think the focusing on usury is a way out of this, because we know it's about charging of interest. And if you start looking at your life and look at every aspect of your life where money is being transferred, then you can quickly identify where you have allowed yourself to be a slave of usury, and then work to get yourself out of it. And that's something very practical everyone can do. And can you imagine if how many hundreds of millions of people in the United States all started saying, I've got to get myself out of usury, what that would do to the economy?
That's a wonderful point. Douglas, I can see you want to jump in there. That's actually excellent. And I would say one thing to do also, because people are so addicted to all of these things, is go focus on service. Go be of service, and you will solve those addictive processes that when you're sitting there wondering, what do I do if I'm not doing these things? Go serve. So go ahead, Douglas.
The Radhanites invented the social credit system. The way they did it is they took a religion, Hebrewism, which said they cannot have any temple and that they can only have the 10 Commandments. And they twisted it up so bad that they built 2 temples, now they've built a third one that is a secret temple, and which I have the inside track on to know that it is in fact already built. But really, what were they doing? They were taking what was a belief and turning it into a system of control through economics, through laws that the common person had to follow, but the elite didn't. And the elite were in control of whether or not they could, first off, be considered a true Hebrew, which you had to once a year go and make sacrifices at the temple with money that had to be changed. So when Christ at his time was entering the temple, he was not only saying that the money changers were wrong, he was saying the temple itself shouldn't exist. He's saying that the belief in having a king like Solomon or David, no, the Old Testament said to do the absolute opposite of that. So what we really have is that Jesus was not a what you would call a Jew or a Hebrew at that time because he was an Essene. He was born in Nazareth. If you look it up, you'll find there never was a city named Nazareth. Nazareth was the name of a closed Essene community that was a walled community that you couldn't even enter unless you were an Essene. And that's the reason why his followers carried a knife, kind of like a sword, always with them, because they were to defend themselves from those evil ones that were claiming to be the high priests or claiming to be Jews or Hebrews who had returned from Babylon. Complete and absolute nonsense. The Old Testament tells us that all Levites, the priestly caste from the tribe of Levi, were in fact completely eradicated. So how was it that they were able to continue their practices according to the Talmud and according to what the disinformation tells us in Babylon, when in fact, after they started up again with their practices after the first exile in Babylon, then they came back and the Babylonians saw that they were starting up this nonsense again. So they made sure that they stopped all religious practice, and the only people left in Israel were humble farmers that were farming the land for the Babylonians. So in essence, in Jesus's time, there were no Hebrews left. And so it is a complete myth. But what is true is that we can follow the Old Testament, and it says that they could never, ever follow the 10 Commandments. They couldn't follow any commandment that God ever gave them through their prophets. But one thing that they did follow is what is now already in place today, and it's the proof of what I'm saying. There have been multiple messiahs, the Sabbateans and others. Different people came and said they were the Messiah. Well, what does the Old Testament say the Messiah will do? He will come, he will touch his toe on Mount Zion, and he will then take over the whole world for the Hebrew faith. Well, that did happen. He did come, he did touch Mount Zion, and the Radhanites did take over the whole world through hegemony, through their plan of hegemony, world control through a manipulation of supposed sacred acts that were conducted by their Levite priests. But not one single Levite priest ever returned to Israel, and they were completely extinguished while they were in Babylon, and their new practices that arose out of the Talmud were simply a mix of Radhanite, Babylonian, and ancient Hebrew beliefs. But again, when the Sabbateans were and other messiahs were funded by the Rothschilds and even Weishaupt with his Illuminati, these groups were basically supported by Radhanites you can't get a bigger Radhanite Babylonian cartel member than the Rothschild family. And they supported all of these fake messiahs because the fake messiahs were antinomialists, which means that they believed in doing the opposite of what the 10 Commandments say, so that the Messiah would come, because the Messiah will only come in the greatest moment of the abomination of desolation, which is described specifically in relationship to the Hebrew temple and the sacrifices. And the abomination is basically the continuation of blood sacrifices. So we have now literally fake Jews, Babylonian Radhanite cartel members, who do have us all in debt slave in the Western world, at least. And what are they doing? Following the 7 deadly sins, which are basically the counterpoint to the 10 Commandments. And so you can see that they are incredibly effective. This is a 4,000-year-old institution that today is the hegemony behind debt slavery in the world. And the reason that they want to get into just having one currency is so that then the Rodonite bankers, because now most of the Rodonites, they don't go to church. I know these people. I know these bankers. They don't go to church. They don't believe in the Hebrew faith. They don't believe in anything but themselves and the 7 deadly sins. And do they want the Messiah to return? Well, if they did, then they should read the Old Testament and find the Messiah cannot return unless 2 full-blooded Hebrews bring in a new child who can be the Messiah. But they don't need that because they've already done it. The diaspora was an invasion, and it was an invasion of Rodonite bankers from Babylon, a cartel through family lineages that to this very day still continue, and they are doing a marvelous job because you can see the 7 deadly sins explicated in Hollywood, in the mainstream media, in banking practices, in anything to do with stock markets or the movement of money with gold and silver. Same thing, for instance, let's just take 800,000 people disappear, children, young people disappear in America each year. There is not even a federal agency that investigates all of those. They turn into slaves. The majority of them, 65% of them, came out of social service placements or placements in homes as adopted children. So this is institutionalized now. Economic slavery is one thing, but we're talking about sex slaves. We're talking about economic slaves that work. We know how many are, to this day. You can look it up, and the federal government will tell you how many slaves are being used in China to produce the things that we use in our households here in America. This is well known. They don't go after the people who steal these children. This has been going on since the age of Moloch, wherein child sacrifice, human sacrifice, blood sacrifice was the order of the day. But it has little or nothing to do with the ancient Hebrew faith.
Excellently put. Excellent. And so interesting, all of it. Going to be wanting to dig into more of what you said there. Few things. One, I wanted to say that, yes, slavery is increasing massively in the world again. And did it ever decrease? We're not really sure. But the blatant acceptance of slavery is happening again, where you have really a deadened humanity addicted to Mammon, turning a blind eye to the massive trafficking, to the slavery in China, the slavery in Southeast Asia, the slavery across the world, and just so they can, watch your Netflix, do whatever they want to do. And this kind of willful ignorance is in itself, such a giant problem, and also the reason this can happen at all. But then I also wanted to backtrack here a few things. I want to go here into Zelensky, go back into Ukraine, and back into, the banning now of the Orthodox Christian Church. But first, you said something really major that you skirted over, and I don't know if you want to go further into it. I'm, of course, going to ask about the third temple being built and your inside scoop on that. I know it might be premature, perhaps number 4, if not this one, but of course, have to
I'm
ask.
interested to hear what he's going to say now.
The man in America called the King of the Jews was a close friend of mine. I'm not going to tell you his name, but he gave, when he was alive, he's died a few years ago, he would give $125 million a year to a major Jewish foundation in America and $125 million a year to build the third temple. And it was given directly to the Mossad. So the Mossad protects, if you go to the Wailing Wall and you go up to the Wailing Wall and you look to the left, you'll see kind of like a cave. It's like a tunnel. Go ahead, try to go in there. You will not get in because the Mossad protects it. If you go deep enough into that, they burrowed into an underground tunnel that went to what they call the Mount Moriah, or what is underneath the Dome of the Rock. They say that the old temple, the second temple, was there. That is incorrect. But the point is that because of that belief, that's why they did it. They literally burrowed in, and they now have the third temple. It's underground, and it is literally built upon that very rock. That rock is not Mount Moriah. That rock was a place where they did human sacrifice. You can still see the bloodletting veins that go off the altar. And it never was the Hebrew temple. It was, in fact, a pagan temple of Baal. and human sacrifice and temple to Moloch. So I know this because I know the person who paid for it.
That's really intriguing, and I kind of think I know who that person is that you're talking about. So I'm going to be digging into that on my own. And so, so is this a giant wag the dog, self-fulfilling prophecy made for Hollywood version that they are attempting to present us with in some um, fake apocalyptic future, giant false
Yes.
flag? Yeah.
And it's exactly what you said. They're killing the Israelites. They're killing the people who think they're Hebrews, who think that they're Jews. Who's killing them? The people who don't live there, the people who are promoting the pharmaceutical World War III, the people who are the Frankists, the people who are the Sabbateans, who to this very day believe that the Messiah has come and that the Rodnite Jews have in fact created a hegemony worldwide. They only have to, clamp down on Russia, clamp down on China a little bit. But let's take, for instance, the fact that Bibi Netanyahu, who of course is a very good friend of the Trump family. Matter of fact, he's the godfather of one of the Trump children. And what did he do? He went and met with Zelensky. And what did they say? They said, oh, it's okay. Ukraine is going to be the new apartheid. On the western side of Ukraine will be the Jews. On the eastern side will be the Orthodox Christians. And so now they're trying to split Ukraine down the middle. Christians go to the east, Jews go to the west, and it'll be apartheid. Well, this is indicative of the fact that the Babylonian Radhanite cartel does in fact rule the world, because right now we've already seen well over $100 billion laundered through Ukraine. We know that with FTX. And, FTX is nothing more than the Sabbatean dream. It's the dream of the Rodanites to have one currency that they control. That is the reason most nations on the earth are going to a central bank digital currency so that it can be controlled. This was the plan of John Maynard Keynes at Bretton Woods and has been the plan of the United Nations. It's the plan for the 2030 agenda. It's the ultimate plan, and Ukraine is the proxy for these Radhanite bankers. And who's the best representative of the Radhanite bankers these days? That would be the Brits. That would be the Pilgrim Society. That would be the fake monarchy who believes that they are the Pope of their own Anglican religion, when in fact the British monarchy it's the most vile history of rulers, I think, ever on the face of the earth. And to this very day, Charles is the major founder was a major supporter and one of the founders of the World Economic Forum, of digital currency, of transhumanism, of all of the evils that we're seeing now are literally being shown to us through the World Economic Forum. But people are waking up, and because of FTX and because of Genesis and because of there were 5 major owners of cryptocurrency companies that have died within the last year. 3 of them were right around the exact time that FTX's fraud became apparent and on the news. So what we have here is the last-ditch attempt of CryptoCoin to basically collapse all currencies. That is their intent. And cryptocurrency from the beginning was a Goldman Sachs, a British founded CIA. I always have to say that with Michael, because the CIA has nothing to do with America. It has to do with corporate interests worldwide, internationalism, transnationalism, globalism. And so essentially what they're doing is they had to collapse all the cryptocurrencies so that their cryptocurrency would be the solution. Well, isn't that exactly what the Rodanites did on the Silk Road? Isn't that what they did on the Roman lines of trade throughout their whole kingdom of the known world at that time? It's the same thing. It's nothing new. This is the same old playbook, and it has hardly changed at all, as Michael has proven. The Babylonian banking families use the same exact tricks, from fractional banking to exorbitant usury to banks not have complete immunity, and take over the royalty, take over the monarchy, take over who's ever in control and marry your daughters to them. This is why Esther was married to a Khazarian or to a Persian, and why the Khazarian mafia, as some people call it, which is complete nonsense. It's the Radhanite mafia, and it's not a mafia, it's a cartel. But they married their daughters to the rulers, and then later the Jesuits used that as a way anytime they wanted to conquer a nation, they sent 2 Jesuits to set up a school for the monarchy. And by the time that the Pope's army got there, they could hand them the keys to the city and demonstrate that the monarchy is now in alignment with the Pope.
Well, and I'll just comment on that. Well said, of course, is that we have, of course, the Christian Orthodox Church being the exact opposition to the Vatican and what is now the Black Pope and the Jesuit Pope. And this outlawing of that and the persecution now of Christians in Ukraine is really stepping things up a notch, right? While they let other groups that are pagan derivatives, continue to do their thing. And now we have in the last 2 days, of course, Zelensky bombing into Russia, deeper into these nuclear air bases. Now, I guess there's a third one today, very close to Moscow, and so they're escalating, right? They want to bring this war intensifying. We have what's happening in Brazil, of course, is another whole matter, which is also very interesting with a lot of what we're talking about as well. But I was wondering, Michael, what do you think about the timing here? What Douglas said about the reasons behind this makes a lot of sense with this new apartheid system, which they're coming up with in a lot of places, by the way, not only Ukraine. So
well, one of the things we need to remember is that the area of the Ukraine, especially down around the Crimea, is ancient stomping ground for the Radhanites. Because what we now know from history is that when the Seljuk Turks started attacking Babylon and eventually seized Babylon, the Radhanites had planned and already started moving to Europe and rebranding themselves as Ashkenazi Jews. And so they had already subsumed the Khazarian Empire, and that shored up for them the western half of the Silk Road. So the Silk Road went through the Crimea, and then it went on into Poland, from the Ukraine into Poland and Germany. And so what we see is this network. If you look at a map, if you type Rodnite in the Wikipedia, you'll see a map of some of their trade routes. And I think one of the things that's hard to understand is how one group of people in Babylon could have such control over trade and banking all over Europe. But if you look at that spider web of trails, what you'll see is a capability that's spread out all over the known world. And the other thing to realize is that when before trucks and before even ships, the Silk Road trade had a way station, let's say every 30 miles. And each one of those way stations had somebody that was running it. A Radhanite was running it from Babylon. And so they had these agents spread out all over the known world. And so the other thing they were doing as they moved their trade along those routes is they would issue letters of credit. And that way they didn't have to actually carry the gold or silver or payment. Sometimes it was even in grain. They would issue these letters of credit. And it was the Radhanites who very early on had control of letters of credit all over the known world. So there you have essentially the creation of money as a means of exchange. And it was tightly controlled by the Babylonian Radhanites. And so part of that network went through the Ukraine. And so it does make sense that what Zelensky and Netanyahu are doing is essentially seizing territory. There's probably a good phrase for it, but they're basically seizing the homeland. And that's what's actually happening. And so the Orthodox Church and a lot of people, it's hard to understand the difference between Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Orthodox, and the fact is there's not a lot of difference. They have the very same belief systems, and the worship services are essentially the same. And so what we have been looking at in terms of history and in propaganda is the fact that one of the greatest anecdotes to mind control and slavery is for someone to have a belief in God. And what we see in the Western Church is that the Pope, very early on, that doesn't mean all the people within the Roman Catholic Church, but the popes were definitely cutting deals with the Rodinite agents all over Europe. And that became the system that ended up being the banking system that we know today. And that was the Roman Catholic Church was quite involved in that whole activity. That never happened with the Eastern Orthodox patriarchs and the churches and the bishops and the people there. And so you had this difference of approach. The other main difference is the Roman Catholic Church spoke Latin, and the ancient Orthodox world spoke Greek. And then as they moved up into Russia, spoke Russian or a derivative Ukrainian. And so these differences carry on to this day. And I'm sure that what's going on in the Ukraine is Zelensky's not getting anywhere with the Orthodox because they're not Nazis, and they believe in the Holy Trinity. And what Zelensky and Netanyahu are about is Babylonian paganism. And so of course, the Orthodox Church is not going to go along with it. And he probably tried for a long time to make a distinction between Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Orthodox, but Orthodox are not that easily fooled. And so what's now happened is he's obviously given up on that idea, and he's just going to kick them all out or move them all east or whichever way, kind of in a Ukrainian Trail of Tears. It sounds like he's got an idea for.
Yeah, let me ask you about that. And also, Michael, I'm not sure, but I think if you could turn your volume down just a tad, maybe I'm getting a little bit of feedback. So I just hopefully.
Okay, how's that?
It's probably fine. I think that's a little better. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and so yes, what do you think that's going to look like? What is your guesstimation on what happens now to the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine?
Well, the Orthodox Christians historically have been used to persecution because for 90 years, the communists, who are basically Babylonian Radinites, oppressed that part of the country. And so therefore, this idea of persecution is not a new item for them, and one they have been. There's only one generation that's really happened between people our age and today that don't remember that too well. But anybody that's 50, 60 years old remembers the old days, remembers the persecution. And so for them, what Zelensky's trying to do is going to be very familiar. They've seen this before. They've watched the communists try to put people in mental institutions because they had faith. And so this is nothing new. They've seen their economies fragment, and they've watched the black market develop. They've seen the way the elites live at one level and then want the peasants to live at the low level and have limited supply. They issued passports to travel between cities in the old Soviet Union. Now, isn't it interesting that just today we hear that the city of Oxford in England is attempting to create zones within the city that people are not going to be allowed to pass between the zones more than a certain number of times a year before they're going to be prevented from travel. This is typical tyrannical behavior to limit the mobility of free thinkers.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it is very disturbing. But par for the course, they're also just outside Oxford in Oxfordshire. They're planning to do, a mock climate lockdown in early 2024 to introduce everybody to sequestering in their house when they're told to because of climate. And that's happening. And there's also other cities in England doing the same thing with this kind of rerouting everything. So you're not allowed to drive within the city. You have to go on loop roads, but then you have to get a permit. I think in Oxford, as you were saying, people will have to, per household, not per person or per car, but per household, you can only 200 days of the year, or 100 days of the year, something like 2 days a week, you can leave your 15-minute area. Okay, you have to pay for this permit to drive outside of your tiny area, and then that's per household. So if you have 3 people with 3 cars, or whatever, that's divided up between a household, so one address. And this is what they're doing. And again, of course, it's ushering this digital passport ID, because in order to go through these barriers, actual roadblocks, actual blocking off of what is now forms the city, is going to be going through literal checkpoints. Right? This is just like you said, like Soviet Union, like Nazi Germany, like apartheid South Africa, and I guess what's coming to Ukraine. And they get to do it on their terms, but it is going to be in the social credit score system, transhumanist.
Well, the interesting thing about that is why Oxford? Because if you look at the history of the British Pilgrim Society, Oxford was the place where they recruited all their future blood. And so, in Oxford's not that big a city. I lived about 25 miles southwest of Oxford, and it's interesting that it's occurring in Oxford. And I was wondering why that's true, and that's probably because of all the places in the country that these guys think they can control, because they've been essentially through the Rhodes Scholarships feeding these Babylonian Radonites into their whole control system. That's probably the place where you've got the greatest collection of Babylonian Radonites to try this with. And then everybody else is a victim, probably of Stockholm syndrome, that they've been so beaten down for so long that they're going to go along with it. And I think they need one place where they can show that this actually works besides China.
Well said. Well said. Absolutely. And I think you're right that it's like we see with the shots, the willingness of all of the people without God to just take the shots, the kind of leftist liberal CNNers and MSNBCers, are half of them are dead now. They're just dying off because of their willingness to sacrifice themselves to this system. And so it's very disturbing, and exactly what is needed is this sacrifice, this consistent sacrifice to this building up to this Antichrist transhumanist God thing, system that they're building. And so let's move on from there a bit and just kind of start winding up here towards the end here. I wanted to maybe, if you didn't mind, getting a little bit into, as we move towards Christmas and solutions, and the alternative to this, what is the opposite of this? What is, this system has been building for thousands of years, and it's looking to create its own, it's creating the beast system, it's creating its own end game. And what would be your opinion, Douglas? I'm wondering to hear first of what the alternative looks like. I liked what Michael said earlier about, you look at your finances and you make changes. But what about the larger spiritual aspect here, and humanity's ability to turn this around?
Well, the Rodnite economic fascists, who then married into the Khazarians, we shouldn't forget the Swedes, the Rus. The Rus came down the Dnieper to Kiev, and they took control of it. Those were Swedes. Those were Vikings. And between the Swedes and the Normans and the Lombards, who then went all the way down into Italy and took over for the Jewish bankers in Venice, then they moved back up to Switzerland. And today, to this very day, the Lombards, the House of Savoy, still control all of the money, the biggest money in the world, which is from derivatives, trillions and tens of trillions of dollars worth of derivatives, which is all betting. Well, that's what this is. This is economic fascism. So it's going on in Ukraine right now, and they are the party of the region. Party of the region were initially the supporters of Nazism. But what is Nazism? Nazism is British, because the British are, in fact, of the House of Hanover. They are from William the Conqueror on, William Orange. They were all Germans. And so the German attempt to create the Third Reich, or actually the Second and the Third Reich, was simply a mix between what would be called Swedes or Vikings mixing with people who said that they were Jews so that they could be the court Jews. The Vikings basically were most of the houses of Europe are all made up. It's complete nonsense. There is no historical proof. Many of them say they came from Melusina and from fairies, literally from supposedly non-human beings. And so the British monarchy is the German Fourth Reich, and the British are the ones bombing Russia. Their British commandos were the first ones to bomb Russia. They're the ones who started the war. They bombed the bridge in Crimea. They are the ones who dropped the bomb on Poland and tried to blame it on Russia. They're the ones behind all of the false flags that have supposedly supposed to draw all of us into this World War III. It's the same old story. Remember that in London, both Russian communism, Chinese communism, and fascism were all incubated right there in London. We've proven that, and we've told you exactly where it happened, who it happened with, and when it happened. So it's nothing new, but here's the good news. The good news is, just like Rome, this hegemony, this global world power is going to simply kill itself. It's going to rot from the inside out. I mean, just take a look at Klaus Schwab and his World Economic Forum. Is there anybody who doesn't? Is there anybody who likes them? Is there a single common person out there that doesn't know that they're economic fascists? Is there anyone who doesn't know that cryptocurrency was fake? $100 billion have been stolen from the crypto exchanges. Why would anybody get involved in it? But I know young people who bought into Bitcoin, and they're going to hang on to it until it goes into negative numbers because they believe in the idea that there should be such a thing. Well, there will not be such a thing. It will not happen. It will not work. Even though the Sogdians and later the Radenites controlled the currency on the Silk Road, and later the Dutch East India Company, British East India Company, Hanseatic League controlled currency exchange, controlled the money of the world, controlled merchandising of the world, commercialism, or what they called trading with the sword. It's the same thing today, but now it has come to its end. It will die, and it will die in the spring of this year. The attempt to go into cryptocurrency will die then, and America will eventually well, it's actually the German Anglican American connection. That is who has been leading us since 1415. Well, that is going to die out. And in the end, it will go to Russia because Russian people, the common people, still have beliefs based upon their direct experience. And the communism, the British communism there now with the dictator, Vlad the Impaler Putin, is in fact it's just repeating history. And if you study history, you will not be surprised by the way this has gone, nor the way that it will go. It will completely falter and rot from the inside out.
Well, that's very hopeful and very interesting. I would love to get into that further with you in subsequent videos here going forward, because we need hope in order to direct our energy. And of course, the biggest hope, of course, is in God and in our faith. And when you put it there, the answers come to you. The ways forward come, and we need to unify in that with each other. I think is a really important part of this. That so much distraction keeps people from being in communion with each other, being in communion with God. And we need that so much, and especially as we go here into this Christmas season, they're trying to whip up this stuff, the ridiculousness with Kanye West and the big show going on with Elon Musk, and the focus on the fake Nazi versus anti-Semitism versus the real Nazis in Ukraine, the real Nazis that actually run the world, as you're saying, that run this country, that were brought over here by the Vatican rat lines and employed and are running this country now. And of course, last week we had Prince William. We had the grifter from England come over and basically give all these awards to basically, they're trying to just push as much World Economic Forum control of our energy system in this country as possible. So they gave away a bunch of money basically to Europeans to come in here and further destroy our energy production. And this is all, of course, interconnected with everything going on, all the crypto deaths, the Pinot family, Red River West, all of these fake investment companies where you go and you invest and you're going to get a great return, and they're going to take that money and use it to destroy the supply chain of the entire world, right? And to bring in this Internet of Things and all of that. And so we do need a deep faith here. And
Well, let me
yeah,
propose two things.
Jump in there, Mike.
Let me propose two parables that Jesus told us, and one of them is the parable of the talents, and another one is the parable of the sower. And I think that it's easy to get dispirited, disheartened, because all these problems seem so big, and I'm just one person. And I think that it can stop people, and they can just get fearful and not want to do anything. And that's not what Jesus said. He said, first of all, each of you's got different talents. Some of you have one talent, some 5, some 10. And the whole point of the parable of the talents is use what you have and move it forward, or plant it, invest it, and watch it grow. Don't worry about what you don't have, but rather worry about what you do have and what you do know, and work from that basis. Don't jump out beyond yourself. Just take the talent God gave you, whatever it is. It could be a skill, it could be money, it could be an opportunity that will come your way, and you use that to its fullest and invest in your energies in that. And in doing that, you can lay your head down at night saying, I did my best that day. And if you do that every day, it's amazing the things that can happen. So that's the parable of the talent. And then we have the parable of the sower, where the sower went out with seed and threw the seed out, and some of it went on good ground, some of it stony ground, some of it rocky ground, and some on good soil. Well, as a sower, we don't necessarily know how what we're saying or doing is going to affect another person, but that's not really the control here. The call is to just do it. Just spread those seeds of love, of faith, of hope. And some of those seeds are going to sprout on good soil, and those will be the ones that will contribute something very positive in your world. And if you do that every day, in addition to the parable of the talents, then you've done everything you can possibly do. And if you do that every day, amazing things will happen, I think.
That's wonderful, wonderful, and yeah, just brings my spirits right up, and so true. Oh, it's so good to focus in on that. And so, Douglas, how would you like to round up here at the end?
I believe I don't have a good closing statement, but I believe in everybody's heart. I believe that if you have Christ on the throne of your heart, then that will get you through this. And awakeness, bringing things into the light, destroys the mold and the scum. And that's what we need to do. That's what we're doing now with all of our energy at both Americans for Innovation and Aim for Truth. We are basically bringing to light the truth, and the truth is the most powerful thing in the earth. So the way, the truth, and the life, that is what Jesus Christ is. And if we stick to that, then we will get through.
Beautiful. I love it. It's really true. And my pastor was saying last week something about that. The generosity repels the devil, right? That the devil can't handle that kind of both service and generosity, and by giving. And there's such a thing as a gift economy. There's such a thing as you pay it forward without expectation. This giving literally shuts down evil, and it really raises the vibration of everything around you. And it's just one way to understand that concept of that our first fruits all come from God. That's our foundation, that everything that we value really comes from God. And so we give it all back in the godly direction. And that's what I would say at the end. And there's the saying, the more I give, the less I want, but the more I want, the less I give. So look at your own tentacles of greed in your life. Do what Michael said. Go look at your finances. Where are you putting your money? Are you supporting Mammon? Take that back, give that in service, give it freely. And so I think we'll leave it there. This has been a wonderful episode. I want to thank you both so much. And you can go ahead and find their wonderful work here at Douglas Gabriel at Gabriel's Horn on Gab, and then Mike McKibben at americansforinnovation.blogspot.com. I am You Are Free TV. I want to thank you all so much. Please support their work. And if you want to support the channel here, there's also ways to do so below. So thank you both. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and Merry Christmas to you.
Thank
you.